Highland Cemetery basically was started in 1869. They were looking for land. 6th Street, Craig Street Cemetery had filled. They thought Linden Grove was filling up, so they were looking for land. So they came out what was the Turnpike in those days, and they ended up with 3 pieces of property. And the first piece they bought was 41 acres, and they bought it because there was a house on it for the sexton. And then there were 2 other adjoining pieces of property. Nothing really was done at the cemetery until they sold $20,000 worth of lots, so there'd be enough money to get started. It really didn't take long because a number of the wealthier citizens in northern Kentucky bought large plots. And as some of the names are around here that you're familiar with just went on and they would buy 50, 60 lots. They had extended families and they had numerous children, and a lot of children didn't live to adulthood, so there was a great need for a lot of cemetery plots at that time.
The chapel behind you, cornerstone, reads 1867. It was started at the beginning of the cemetery and coincided with the opening of the cemetery in 1869. It's a receiving chapel, and this could be where services were held when people were brought in for burial, or in the wintertime it's where they would store the caskets until spring. If the ground was frozen and they could not dig a grave, they would keep them in the receiving chapel.
I'm sure you're all familiar with William Goebel, who was assassinated in office. The governor was assassinated in office. His mother and father are buried right over here. We're still researching a lot of what about his father, but we do think that he was a Civil War soldier, Union Civil War soldier, served in Pennsylvania. There is a Civil War marker on his grave. That's about all we know about him right now, but we're still researching that.
Early cemeteries were pretty much just laid out they were city cemeteries or churchyard cemeteries. So they were found next to the church or laid out in rows. You might have a little walkway between the rows, but primarily they were based on a rectangular or square plan. Very neat and orderly. May or may not have big trees that grow up inside the cemetery, but they're pretty much laid out on straight lines. The rural cemetery movement actually started in Europe very early in the 19th century. Their city cemeteries were also filling up, and there was a lot of concern at the time about disease, and people rightly connected decaying bodies in cemeteries with diseases. They didn't know why, but they knew that there was some kind of connection. There was a movement to move the cemeteries out of the cities, to put them out onto higher ground, into a rural setting, to get people out of the city. So they became almost like parks at the time. So we're talking 1820s, 1830s. That movement picked up here in the United States. Gothic stuff was coming in at the same time, kind of classical movements. They want to get back to nature. And when you walk around a cemetery like this one, which is a successor to that type, we'll talk about in a minute, you're looking at winding paths, plantings, big trees, all sorts of shrubs and plantings underneath. If you look around here, it's all open. The first rural cemeteries were actually quite crowded with underbrush. They actually had to have full-time staff to take care of all of the underbrush, and it got very expensive. And a lot of the boards and the commissions that ran some of these cemeteries, realized that they're spending a lot of money on upkeep. And then around the mid-19th century, the movement changed a little bit. A Prussian immigrant named Adolf Strauch, who was the superintendent at Spring Grove Cemetery, and he was a pioneer in the lawn cemetery movement. And Highland Cemetery is a lawn cemetery. We're surrounded by lawns. In the rural cemetery movement, before that, you would have small lanes, but then you would have pathways that wandered among the graves. And there would be plantings and lots of shrubs and underbrush, quite crowded really. The lawn cemetery movement opened that vista out. And so you're looking at an open landscape with the grave markers spread out through the cemetery, and your walking now takes place on the lanes that you also would drive the horse and carriage on. They still served as ways to get out of the city. All right, people would still come out and have picnics. visit their loved ones, get under the shade of the trees and into the fresh air and out of the city.